See lots of participants joining. Just wait a few minutes for everyone to dial in. I think we might get a few more joiners, but I think given the tightness of the time, I'm going to kick this off. So welcome everybody. Welcome to the latest of our Economic Research Council Viewpoints session. Tonight we have Lord Lamont in conversation with Yanis Varoufakis on the future of the European Union after Brexit. And I'm going to hand over in a moment to Lord Lamont to lead the introductions of Yanis, but before I do, I just want to let everybody know that everybody is on mute and videos are off until after 7 o'clock, when we will invite you to join an informal after session. But until then, we would love to hear your questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom. If you'd like to pose your questions in the Q&A button, I will try and curate these towards the end of the session and give you and voice your questions to either Lord Lamont or Yanis, depending on where they're directed. And on that note, I'd like to hand over to Lord Lamont, who is the President of the Economic Research Council and needs no further introduction from me, I'm sure. So, Lord Lamont, the floor is yours.
Jackie, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce you to all Yanis Varoufakis, my friend, who was, as you know, Minister of Finance in Greece in 2015. Sometimes people are a bit puzzled by the fact that we're friends. We became friends, met long before he became a politician, some years ago, when we were debating against each other in Australia, in Melbourne. If I remember, it was about the state of the Eurozone and about the Euro. We were opposing sides, but found that we were both making the same arguments. And from that point onwards, we became friends and kept in touch until suddenly we exchanged a lot of emails. And then suddenly, I think at the end of 2014 or the beginning of 2015, I got an email from Yanis which said, "You will be as surprised as I am to know that I'm about to become a politician. And if the opinion polls are correct, I will be elected tomorrow and I'm likely to become Minister of Finance. Whatever will I do after that?" Well, it was the beginning of a very eventful period. As people will recall, the Syriza government was elected on a platform of rejecting the austerity proposals that had been made by the EU. Syriza, and Janis, who of course became the subject of intense and, to my mind, unfair criticism, because they had inherited an untenable, terrible situation, and whoever's fault it wasn't theirs. Yanis very quickly came to the conclusion that the demands that the EU were making on austerity were pretty unreasonable, that it was pointless to go on in terms of loans extending and pretending. The amount of indebtedness was not repayable in any practical timetable. But of course, this ran straight into opposition from Germany, who wanted to conceal the fact of any bailout or any rescue, not wanting to set a precedent, and much preferred extending and pretending. But the result was, in my opinion, very unreasonable demands for primary surpluses extending into the distant future. Really quite unrealistic were being made. Throughout this period, Yanis and I remained in close touch. I was happy to support him, happy to introduce him to a few people in London, including George Osborne, who I had hoped to convert to the view that Yanis was not being unreasonable, but I'm not sure that I entirely convinced George Osborne. Anyway, the situation developed into a headlong confrontation between Yanis the Greek government and the Troika, consisting of the ECB, the IMF, and the European Commission, all of whom stuck together. But it was noticeable that the IMF was clearly much more sympathetic to Yanis's position and did believe that some debt restructuring was necessary, and it couldn't just all be on terms of austerity and cutting public expenditure. Anyway, they then got to the situation where Mr. Tsipras called a referendum to reject the Troika's terms. Yanis made it clear that if the referendum went in favor of accepting the Troika's terms, he would resign. What happened, of course, as people will recall, was that the referendum rejected the proposals put forward by the European Union, 61.5% of the population voting against the austerity package in favor of rejecting it. Yanis, I think, assumed that this would mean that he could carry on and the negotiations would carry on, but in a truly, to me, amazing and puzzling U-turn, spectacularly so, Mr. Tsipras decided to accept the terms of the European Union. How he got away with it, I don't know, but Yanis resigned after this very honorably. He has subsequently since founded his own political party. He has his own strong views on the directions in which Europe should go. And in July 2019, he was elected to the Greek parliament. So that is really a bit of background about Yanis. He has many, many views about how Europe should develop, about the Brexit negotiations, the lessons to be drawn from that. But I've asked him to talk tonight to us about post-Brexit Europe and how he thinks it might develop. So Yanis, pleasure to see you. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Norman. Thank you profoundly. It's always a great pleasure for us to renew our relationship, even if we have to do it via video these days. This awkward or weird for some people friendship, I think, has a very solid foundation on, and we are Democrats. We come from different ideological backgrounds, but for instance, in 2016, I reluctantly opposed Brexit and supported Remain, my version of Remain. But from the day after Brexit won, I found myself at loggerheads with Remainers because, in my estimation, a verdict is a verdict, and you know the will of the people has to be respected, which is what did not happen in 2015 in our referendum, as you succinctly put it. And it's what Remainers, or a very large percentage of Remainers, tried to do to the people of Britain who voted to leave. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity to discuss. To actually go into a discussion which, during the last 4 or 5 years of the Brexit saga, even though I have been involved in countless discussions of Brexit, this is a unique opportunity to talk about not regarding Britain's future after Brexit, but the European Union's future after Brexit. Because it was a major error of many leavers and many Remainers to think of the European Union back in 2016 as a monolith, a given. The question being whether Britain should be in that monolith, or with that monolith, or without it, or away from it, or outside of it. Brexit was always going to have an impact on the European Union. Even though it is not being discussed, it is wonderful to have this opportunity, and I wish to thank the Economic Research Council for the opportunity to delve into this question of what impact Brexit has on the European Union, and more generally on the future of the European Union now that Britain is out. If you talk to the great and the good in Brussels, as well as in the European capitals, and you ask them the question, so what has Brexit done for the EU? In a version of the original sour grapes of Aesop, remember the original story, parable, is about the fox pretending not to want the grapes simply because she cannot reach them. In that original idea of Aesop's, the dominant response in Brussels today, in European capitals, in Berlin, in Brussels, in Paris, in Rome, and so on, is that, well, good riddance to the Brits. Now that Brexit has happened, we're freed from the shackles of a problematic partner in London, and our response, the European Union's response to Brexit, has been right and proper. And they will cite three important moves that the EU has made, or developments within the European Union, facilitated and maybe occasioned by Brexit. First, they will say that the threat of Brexit, or the threat of the repercussions of Brexit, has caused Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, to shift her position substantially, to remove Germany from the authoritarian group, from the so-called frugals, and to embrace, and that's the second point, a Hamiltonian movement or moment, the acceptance of the notion of a common debt binding the Eurozone, actually the whole of the European Union member states together, something that had never happened before, to have a common debt, in the form of the so-called recovery fund, EU Next Generation Fund, whatever they call it, that they agreed last June. And finally, they will also point to recent developments on the front of attempting to turn the euro into a competitor of the dollar, attempting to give the euro the status of a competing reserve currency. So these three things: Germany out of the authoritarian group, accepting common debt, the creation of a recovery fund, which is a major move towards integration, at least it is presented as such, and finally, the ambition that was caused partly by Brexit, but also by the way in which Donald Trump used the agreement with Iran of the Obama administration of the EU on nuclear disarmament of Iran against the Europeans. If you remember this, the saga on essentially freezing out of the international payment system European companies that continue to trade with Iran. Now, let's assess that claim that the European Union has used Brexit as an opportunity to move towards integration, to make the steps that it should have made a long time ago towards greater integration. That is a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis which I wish to scrutinize. And it is a hypothesis which, let me warn you from the very outset, I shall be dismissing. To begin with, there is a profound difference between preventing the disintegration of the Eurozone and the European Union as a result of some speculative attack on the euro. There is no doubt that in 2010, 2011, up to 2014, I would say, the Eurozone was open to a speculative attack that could have led to an accidental collapse of the Eurozone, which would, in my estimation, been the death knell of the whole of the European Union project. So there's no doubt that death by speculative attack has been prevented, and it has been prevented initially by the creation of the European Financial Stability Facility, which then evolved into the so-called European Stability Mechanism, a kind of IMF for Eurozone member states. And of course, the rapid, or not so rapid, evolution of the European Central Bank into a Fed-like central bank that can actually carry out quantitative easing. The combination of the ESM and quantitative easing, and more recently, the recovery fund that I mentioned before, has created, if you want, the safety net that prevents the Eurozone from crashing as a result of a speculative attack. So it has been protected from that. I don't think there is any significant probability that the Eurozone is going to collapse for the reasons that it nearly collapsed in 2010 when the Greek debt crisis began, and when then there was a sequence of speculative attacks on Irish debt, on Portuguese debt, on Spanish debt, on Italian debt. That has been safeguarded. However, that is not the same as saying that the Eurozone and the European Union has become sustainable, right? Let's pause just for 1 second or minute to look at some numbers. If you set aside quantitative easing, which is effectively the European Central Bank creating more than 5 trillion euros in order to purchase public, mainly public, but also private debt in the attempt essentially to stabilize the financial system, both private and public, of the European Union and the Eurozone in particular. If you set this aside, very little has been done to create what is necessary for debt sustainability within the Eurozone and the European Union. The numbers I was going to mention were that at the moment, the whole of the European Union has a common debt of about 450 billion euros. It's mostly ESM. By the end of 2025, 2026, with a recovery fund, which is funded through common debt, EU bonds, that will have risen to something like 1.2 trillion. That sounds like a lot of money, and it does sound like, there's no doubt that there's no comparison with 2010, when the European Union did not have any common debt. Now it's going to have about 1.2 trillion of a common debt. But that needs to be compared and contrasted to the aggregate picture. Italy on its own, the Italian public debt is something like 2.2 trillion. The French debt is 2 trillion. The German debt, public debt, is 1.5 trillion. So if you compare the public debt of the European Union as a whole with what the EU has borrowed, the latter is a very small proportion and will remain a small proportion. Why is this important? It is important because the capacity, let's take, for instance, the ambition by the European authorities to turn the euro into a competitor of the dollar. It's not going to work. And it's not going to work for 2 reasons. Firstly, the austerity policies that began in Greece in 2010, and which Norman mentioned before, were generalized across Europe. A general, universal authoritarian stance in fiscal policy created a situation whereby the European Union as a whole, and the Eurozone in particular, has gone from a kind of a more or less balanced current account in 2010, 2011, to a very large current account surplus, which is now persistent. And it is the result of the authoritarian fiscal policies. Because when you've got an excess of savings over investment, as we do in the European Union, we have had since 2008, 2009, and you drive the average budget to balance, then it is a truth of geometry. It is not even a theorem. It's an economic identity that you're going to force your economy, the Eurozone economy, to go into a current account surplus. And if you have a current account surplus which is persistent, which is part and parcel of your macroeconomic model, as well as part of the mercantilist model that is the German economy, which is the powerhouse of the European Union, now you end up with a European Union, which is exporting deflation to the rest of the world, to the United States, to Britain, to Latin America, and of course to China. And when you are doing that, your currency can never really compete with the dollar as a reserve currency. Secondly, when the United States is making use of its exorbitant privilege of having the dollar as a reserve currency, this means that foreign players like the Chinese, the Japanese, British industrialists or financiers, they redenominate their wealth, their assets, their savings in US dollars, and immediately they have a huge liquid market in US treasuries that they can invest their dollars in. But what is the equivalent that the European Union can offer the Chinese investor, who might be lured into the idea of switching from dollars to euros? Very little in terms of safe EU bonds. I mentioned before the numbers. At the moment, we have less than €500 billion in common European bonds. The German bonds, which of course sell like hotcakes, are in very short supply. Even though now the German government is spending more, still there is a shortage of German bonds in the markets. So all these wonderful claims, Brussels are coming out with one paper after the other about strengthening the reserve, the euro as a reserve currency. The macroeconomics and the finance, the macrofinance, are not consistent with this ambition. It is just empty ambition because of the current account surplus of the Eurozone and the fact that there is a shortage of a safe common European bond. Let us now go into greater detail regarding debt sustainability. Because even though the European Central Bank now is purchasing Italian bonds, French bonds, as if there is no tomorrow, that is not making the Italian debt more sustainable than it was before. What it does, it provides liquidity to the Italian government to be able to, to roll over its debt. But if you were a Chinese investor, a German investor, a British investor, and you look at the situation in Italy, you look at the situation in Germany, the situation in the Eurozone more generally, and you compare and contrast it with what's happening in Britain, or in the United States, or in Japan, or in China for that matter, the European Union remains the sick man of the world. It is quite remarkable that, just a small aside regarding Greece. You don't hear about Greece these days. You read the Financial Times, you read the Wall Street Journal. Greece is not in the picture anymore. One would surmise, would one not, that Greece must have been on the mend for a while now, not to be, front page news or even 10th page news these days. Well, we're more bankrupt today than we ever were. When the crisis began in 2008, our national income was at around 240 billion euros, 240. When I walked into the Ministry of Finance, it had gone from 240 to 175. And debt had gone up. Okay? Do you know what it is today? It's 162. So it's much, and what is our debt? 380. So our debt went from 300 to 380, and our income went from 175 in 2015 to 162 today. So, we're more bankrupt than ever. But you don't hear about that. And you don't hear about that because the ECB is now rolling over the Greek debt. Now, how long are they going to be doing this for? Let me give you the answer. Until Berlin balances its own books. At the moment, because of COVID-19, we have this situation where all the constraints, fiscal constraints, part of the fiscal compact have been set aside. However, and this is a hypothesis which we can discuss with Norman and with whoever whoever else wants to challenge this hypothesis of mine. I have no doubt that the moment that they go back to zero, they balance the budget in Berlin, a phone call or an email or a chat message is going to go from Berlin to Brussels, saying, okay, time to start again the process of fiscal consolidation in the rest of the Eurozone. Because you see, we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. If we don't do that and Germany balances its books, whereas the rest of us have -10, -8% of a budget deficit, the divergence, fiscal divergence is going to get worse. If we try to consolidate, the only way of doing that is by having huge new austerity in Italy, in Spain, in Greece, which may consolidate the budget, but what it will do is it will create even more divergence in an already divergent investment arena. So divergence is the name of the game. Independently of whether Berlin clamps down with new austerity in the deficit countries of the Eurozone, or how quickly they will do it, or not, we are going to have greater, more powerful centrifugal forces. So on the one hand, you've got this European Central Bank effectively freezing the situation by means of extending and pretending, by means of rolling over our debts. But at the same time, investment in places like Germany is recovering very quickly, especially in the industrial sector. You already have a capital-intensive economy in Germany, in Holland, in the surplus countries, in Austria. Those countries, those economies, those industrial sectors are hit far less badly by COVID-19 than tourism, services, and so on. So an already imbalanced, unbalanced Eurozone economy is seeing its imbalances grow exponentially. Now, the supporters of the status quo in Brussels will say, yes, but Yanis, you are not taking into consideration the recovery fund. Because that is the only thing that I've not discussed so far, and the only thing that they have as an argument in favor of the thesis that the European Union this time has responded to its crisis, unlike 2010, 2011, with a degree of rationality towards greater integration. The recovery fund, let's look at the recovery fund. The recovery fund has been heralded as a pivotal moment because for the first time, Berlin accepted the concept of common debt. Common debt for the purposes of transferring money that has been commonly borrowed to the countries that have been hit most badly by the COVID-19 recession. You have heard large numbers, 750 billion euros. This is, of course, typical smoke and mirrors from Brussels. The real number is 310. In other words, the true fiscal transfer is 310. The rest is loans, which we don't need because the ECB is already providing liquidity. The ESM can provide even cheaper loans than the recovery fund. So the 750 number was simply announced because it sounds large. In reality, the grants component is only 310. This is 0.4% of GDP on average in a Eurozone that needs at least 5, 6, 7% as a fiscal stimulus and investment stimulus. If you compare, in other words, what the British government has done or the American government has done, the firepower of our recovery fund is 1/10, at best 1/10 of what the UK did and what the US did. But that's not the complete story. It actually is worse than that. Because it's not just that it is too puny, the recovery fund. It was also designed as if in order to create great friction and more division in Europe. And allow me to remind you of the process that they agreed to, which is, in my estimation, the epicenter of this divisiveness. And instead of telling you or reminding you of what it is that they did, I will narrate it by creating, you know, a hypothetical parable in the United Kingdom. Imagine that the United Kingdom was not a fiscal union. And imagine that every county operated in the same way that every member state of the EU operates. And imagine that the Bank of England was not banned from financing the banks of Surrey, the banks of Yorkshire, the banks, and also the counties could not be financed directly by the Bank of England. In other words, imagine that the United Kingdom was structured in the way that the Eurozone is structured as we speak. And suppose that all the representatives of the different counties or regions of the United Kingdom were to come together and to agree to a recovery fund for the post-COVID-19 period. And they agreed to raise debt commonly, to issue a gilt, a bond together, right? But the money that is going to be transferred to every county would have to be agreed to by the politicians around this large table where the different counties and regions of Britain or the United Kingdom would gather, and they would have to do, you know, negotiations, you know, barter between them, or, you know, just you know, bargaining sessions. And they would have to agree who gets what, which county gets which sum of money, before you knew the extent to which every county was affected by the recession or even by COVID-19. That, you can imagine the kind of atmosphere you would have in that room. It would be toxic. And imagine that if some, you know, let's say the representatives of Sussex or, you know, the home counties were to keep pointing fingers at the northerners who are scroungers and who want to use the borrowing capacity of the home counties in order to, you know, facilitate their projects and to cover up for the fact that the North has, or the coastal British counties have not been as successful as they have. And imagine that they even demanded the right to veto the eventual transfer of monies at some point in some future meeting. Look, the reason why I'm making this comparison is for you to understand that this would be a complete nightmare. This could not be an occasion for Britain to come together. It would be an occasion for Britain to be pulled apart. So this recovery fund, in the end, not only is it too puny, but it is also so structured, politically structured, that it, you know, with mathematical precision, is going to be leading to greater political tensions and also to corruption. Because let me put it clearly, succinctly, if I can. A fiscal union works because politicians do not try to substitute the role of the automatic stabilizers. When you have a proper fiscal union like the United Kingdom is, or the United States is, right? You don't have politicians deciding how the common debt that is incurred by the central government is divided across the land, because when unemployment increases in Yorkshire faster than it does in Surrey, then automatically through the automatic stabilizers, you know, more money goes to Yorkshire, but not because of there is a political horse trading process in deciding that. So let me begin to summarize so as to move on to the next stage, which I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A. The verdict that I'm coming to is that in the European Union, post-Brexit, we're going to have to deal with a very low level of investment in comparison to available savings and liquidity, much lower. That is excess savings, excess liquidity, much greater than the UK, the US, and China. This undermines all plans for challenging the dollar. a lack of solid Eurobonds backed by a broad federal tax base is impeding the financial integration of the Eurozone. And therefore, the deflationary processes that have been undermining European unity over the last few years, the last 10 years or so, since 2008 at least, they're going to accelerate. So we have a disconnect. The narrative in Brussels is that we have greater integration, but on the ground, in the foundations of the European Union economy, we have centrifugal forces that are pulling us apart, and the new institutions that are being created, like the Recovery Fund, are very well put together from a propaganda point of view, but macroeconomically and macrofinancially, they are not fit for purpose. We have widening economic imbalances within our countries and between our countries in the European Union. And the result of that is going to be, and we're already seeing this, moribund politics. The political conversations, the political dialogue, the debates in Germany and in France in particular, are becoming increasingly irrelevant and disconnected from the real issues that I'm trying to highlight here tonight. In a sense, COVID-19 has accelerated a pre-existing systemic EU economic crisis. It reminds me a little bit of a Mariuszka or a Babushka Russian doll. We have one crisis within another crisis within another crisis. We have the COVID-19 recession, which is embedded within or encased within the Euro crisis, which has not gone away. And that Euro crisis is embedded within a broader secular stagnation crisis, to use Larry Summers' expression, that began with the creation of, at least the creation of the Euro, in the late 1990s when our currencies were locked together. Finally, before we start the conversation, allow me a political and more sentimental comment on my part. And I shall speak personally now. It is the one thing I lament about the situation post-Brexit in the European Union is that with, the loss of you folks, the loss of Britain, it is becoming increasingly difficult, or actually I would say increasingly impossible, to steer a rational course between being, a Euro loyalist, somebody who thinks that we live in the best of all possible Europes, that is, Brussels speak, and being a Eurosceptic or an anti-European. I try to, from the beginning, I try to do that which I've always done vis-a-vis the political establishment in Greece. I'm a patriot. If I turn against my government and I criticize my government, which I've been doing since I was a young person in this country, it is because I'm a patriot. It's not because I hate Greece. So similarly, as a Europeanist, I always felt the need to be critical of what's going on in Europe at the European Union level. As a Europeanist, that is utterly impossible now. And Brexit has made it even more impossible. So now we have a situation whereby either, you celebrate triumphantly the achievements of the great and the good in Brussels, and you are a Europeanist. Or if you are critically engaging with what they do, then you're drowned out as being on the side of, Marine Le Pen in France or the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. It is becoming hard to have a nuanced conversation in the European Union, and that was always difficult, as Norman will testify to. But with the absence of Britain, the departure of Britain from the European Union is becoming far less possible to have a conversation about things that are evident and things that are happening in front of our eyes without being drowned out by the two extremes, those who accept that whatever the European Union is doing must be the right thing, and those who want to see the disintegration of Europe. Thank you.
Well, Yanis, thank you very much indeed. The difficulty I have in starting a conversation about this is I think I agreed with almost every word you said. Certainly agree that this was not a Hamiltonian moment at all. It's a pea shooter, the rescue fund or whatever it's called. And as you so rightly pointed out, the individual debt levels of individual countries dwarf that of the so-called collective liability. And I also agree very much with what you're saying about how it heightens tensions between the different countries, or will heighten tensions between the different countries. And I also strongly agree there's no possibility of the euro becoming a reserve currency. I will pose 2 or 3 questions before we open it up to the audience, but I'd like to go back, if I might, in history, because I am interested. When you were Minister of Finance, just one question on that. How on earth did Mr. Tsipras manage to make the U-turn he did that caused your resignation? How on earth did he get away with it when you'd had this 61.5% majority for rejecting the package? I've never understood how he managed to do that.
Oh, there's a very clear answer to this question, but I have to say to you that the reason why I had not resigned until the night of the referendum was because, like you, I never imagined that it would be possible for him to do it. So I was wrong. How did he do it? Well, look, I've explained.
How did he get away with it?
Well, this is interesting. Well, first, let me be clear on something. At the time, I was trying to look the other way, because, you know, when you are involved in a government, as you know from your own personal experience, you really want to believe in your colleagues. You really want to believe in your prime minister. You really want to believe that your prime minister is on the side of the angels and that he says what he means and means what he says. It wasn't true. He held this referendum. I was suspecting it very strongly a week before the referendum, but he had the referendum to lose it, not to win it, Norman. And to his horror, we won it. I agreed with him. I thought that we were going to lose it. The difference between Tsipras and me was I wanted to win it, and I feared we were going to lose it. He wanted to lose it. Okay? That was the difference between us. And then on the night of the referendum, when, you know, I had written my letter of resignation on the assumption that we were going to lose it that Sunday. And, you know, when the opinion polls came, the exit polls came out, and then the actual result, which was even more spectacular than the exit polls, I rushed to his office and I was jubilant. And there I saw him sitting in his chair, a picture of misery and devastation that we had won it. And, you know, after 3 hours of an argument where I tried to revive his spirits and to say, we need to honor the people. You know, you brought them out there and you told them to vote no. Now, I don't care what you say and what you think. You have a democratic duty to respect the fact that they responded to your call, to our call, and they voted for no. And he said, no, it's time to surrender. So, you know, when I realized that he had already committed to surrendering, you know, Merkel knew that he was about to surrender, that he had already surrendered to her. Then it was exit stage left for me. So that's, yeah. And how did he get away with it? Well, journalists were putting this question to me because, you know, remember, he was actually quite smart. He signed the memorandum, you know, the new loan, he took the credit card that they were giving him to extend and to pretend under conditions of brutal taxation, you know, 100% prepayment of next year's taxes this year by small businesses, you know, cutting by 70% the lowest of pensions, you know, a left-wing government doing that. And yeah, 3 months later, he had held an election, which I did not contest, and he won it again. And the reason, of course, he won it was that election in September 2015 was contested by a conservative party that was gung-ho about the Troika, right? And were very enthusiastic about implementing the Troika's plan and policies and tax hikes and all that. And you had Tsipras, who was reluctant. And the way I put it to the journalists is, okay, suppose you had a choice between being tortured by an enthusiastic torturer and a torturer who does not really want to torture you, but he's going to do it to keep his job. Whom would you choose? I think that's how he got away with it.
Still seems a bit of a mystery to me. I know you had some very sharp exchanges with the Troika, and you have voiced some very, very strong and very bitter, and quite rightly, criticisms of the way the Troika and, well, not so much the Troika, I want to concentrate on the EU and the Commission behave towards you and towards Greece. But at one point, from some of your utterances, you seem to suggest that you saw a parallel between the way they were behaving in the Brexit negotiations and how they behaved towards Greece during the Troika discussions.
Oh, more than a parallel. It was the same playbook. Of course, they did not have the same leverage with you that they had with us, because there's a profound difference. Imagine if Brussels could press a button and all the ATMs in London, in Manchester, in Birmingham, in Glasgow, and in Edinburgh stopped working. Then you know the Brexit negotiations would have been a very different animal to what they were. But their playbook was the same. I wrote an article in The Guardian, I believe, in which, immediately after the Brexit referendum, in which I tried to warn Theresa May on what she was going to face. And I don't remember exactly now the subtitles of my article, but one of them was the EU runaround. So, you know, you go to Brussels, they say, we cannot discuss, you know, whatever it is, the future agreement, the long-term agreement between Brussels and London, unless we first settle everything regarding money, people, Ireland, and so on. And if you want to discuss, to include this second phase in the first phase negotiations, go to Merkel and talk to Merkel about it. And then you go to Merkel and she says, no, there's nothing I can do about that. You have to go to Brussels. So this is the runaround. This is standard. Okay, Merkel would, or Schäuble would always say to me, it's not in my competence to discuss things with, you know, the Greek debt with you, which was of course everything, because if you don't discuss the debt, when the debt, it's like being a cancer patient and having a doctor who is refusing to discuss the tumor, right? And then he sends you over to Brussels, and you go to Brussels, no, I cannot talk about the debt, you have to go to Schäuble, or you need to go to Merkel. And then Merkel says, no, you have to go to Schäuble, or you have to go to the IMF. So this runaround, it was always going to happen. It happened in the case of Brexit as well. The Swedish national anthem routine, it was another trick that I had warned about. That is, you know, you go to Brussels, you have you make proposals, and they look at you as if you just sung the Swedish national anthem. In other words, they, you know, blank faces. Why? Because these bureaucrats, they have no mandate to negotiate. You know, they have a piece of paper, and that piece of paper has a number of boxes, and they simply have to tick them. And if you do not tick them with them, they don't have a mandate to negotiate. Barnier never had a mandate to negotiate anything of substance. So we knew that. That's why I was always saying, from the beginning, in the summer of 2016, to all my friends in Britain, I was saying to them, look, make your minds up. Either you're going to settle for a Norway Plus agreement, so stay in the single market, effectively do the softest possible Brexit only at a political level, but stay in the single market and the customs union, or get out. There is nothing in between, really. And only if you decide to get, if you stay in the single market, which is a legitimate thing to do, that's fine. Then it's an off-the-shelf thing that the negotiations are going to go very smoothly. It will be done in no time. But if you don't want that, if you don't want to stay in the single market and the customs union, then there's no point in negotiating. Just, you know, announce that you're leaving, and then say to them, okay, give us any kind of deal you want, and then we'll discuss it. But we're out, and by this day, we're out independently of how these negotiations go. That was what I was saying in the beginning. Theresa May thought she knew better. At the end, you know, we had 4 or 5 years of non-negotiations, or negotiating about negotiating. And then in the end, of course, you know, once it was clear that Boris was getting out, the minimalist agreement that was always going to be offered was offered.
When you were negotiating direct with the Germans and with Mr. Schäuble, did you ever feel that the real target in their minds was not Greece, but other countries, and that they wanted to set an example to you and to have the pretext for addressing the lack of discipline as they saw it in other countries?
Roman, the beauty of that period for me, personally speaking, was that I did not have to speculate. They told me these things. So I did not have to, in answering your question, Wolfgang Schäuble told me, you know, at some point, after hours and hours and weeks and months of, non-discussions between us, towards the end, we managed to reach moments of clarity and moments of honesty, and almost mutual understanding. For instance, we both agreed that Greece was not sustainable in the Eurozone, and that the agreement that the Troika, at his behest and Merkel's behest, were forcing down our throat, would be bad for the people of Greece and bad for the people of Germany. We agreed on that. And then I said to him, so why are you doing it? Why are you forcing down my throat an agreement you know is going to be terrible for my people, and we are not going to be able to repay our debts? Once you agree that you would get more money back if my proposal goes through, not yours, why are you insisting? He said, don't you understand? And he started talking about France. He started saying they cannot have the Deutschmark. He used the word Deutschmark for the euro. They cannot have the Deutschmark and retain national sovereignty over their budget. They have to decide, do they want the mark, the euro, or do they want sovereignty? They can't have both. So I realized what he was telling me. He was telling me that austerity for Greece was a signal to France that they need to give up on the dream that Mitterrand and others from the Socialist Party had in the 1980s, that they can capture the Bundesbank to expand the ambitions of the French ruling class. So it was a typical, Franco-German conflict. And we were, the little mouse that was being trodden upon in order to send a signal.
Last question from me before I hand over to Jackie. But where do you see the EU being in 20 years' time? There was a very interesting comment made by a former British ambassador to Berlin, where he really outlined the argument. He was saying, well, Germany uses the EU for its own purposes, well, as everybody does, but it is a convenient identity, but it can assert its own national interests through this identity and is seen as less assertive. But actually, the tension between a more federal solution or a union of states is there in Germany too, but Germany is quite satisfied with the halfway house that you have now, and that in 20 years' time, he thought the EU would still remain the same halfway house.
Yes, but you see, I think that Germany, in the end, there's no such thing as Germany. There are many Germanys. There are at least 3 Germanys. There is the Germany of the large corporations. There is the Germany of the Mittelstand, of the middle-sized corporations. And then there is the Germany of the little people who are suffering very badly. Over the last, if you look at average earnings of the bottom 60% of the population, they are far worse off today than they were 20 years ago. So it's not that Germany has benefited from mercantilism or as a whole. This is why you have, the revival of the Alternative for Deutschland, nationalist forces, and so on and so forth. So and you know what? I don't think that in the next 10, 20 years, if you ask me about you want a prophecy, I don't have a prophecy, but what I can see is that the mercantilist model that the European Union allowed Germany to continue after the end of Bretton Woods has not been good even for German industry. They have not managed to invest in the second generation or the next generation of the Industrial Revolution. Dieselgate, the fact that they are falling behind in electrification of the car industry, the fact that they're falling behind in artificial intelligence, in green energy, they still have, they're building lignite power stations, for God's sakes. They are relying on Putin and Nord Stream 2. I don't think that even Germany in the end is benefiting from this model. So what is going to happen? Look, I don't think that the European Union is sustainable the way we are. But then again, political will and a lot of wealth, because Europe is still very rich, can sustain the unsustainable for a very, very, very long time. Remember, Keynes's dictum that the market can stay rational longer than I can stay solvent. So, there's something similar applies to the European Union, that it can remain steadfast in its rationality while losing one opportunity after the other to compete internationally.
Jackie, over to you.
Thank you. And I'm conscious I failed abysmally at my attempt to chair because it's been such an interesting discussion. We have a few minutes left until the top of the hour. I'm going to beg your indulgence and ask if you would like to stay on for an extra 15 minutes.
Of course, of course.
Yes, and hear some of the.
Sorry, I thought we had another half hour.
Well, we have an informal half hour, but I'm going to make another formal. Make it a bit more formal.
I'm very sorry. I'm terribly sorry. I misunderstood.
No, not at all. It was a fascinating discussion to hear between the two of you.
No, I would have shut up much earlier. I'm sorry. I was told it's going on till 7:30.
Well, anyway, let's move on to the questions. We have so many, I don't know which to pick first, but I would like to just pull out a sample of them because we've got a lot and we may not get through them all. We have a question here from Dinesh Damja, who was an MEP for London. And he says, Yanis, you talk about Greece being in huge debt. What do you think of 6 US states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Arizona, etc., running up huge deficits and bailed out by the US government, re-breakup? He goes on to say, I put to you that Northern Ireland will leave the Union first, followed by Scotland later, and the EU will stay together past these 2 events.
Well, firstly, I think it's a very useful comparison with the United States. Allow me to not choose Kentucky or Tennessee. He's chosen them because they are deficit states. But I'll use a comparison that I like to make between the great state of Nevada and Ireland back in 2008, because Nevada and Ireland have more or less the same population and more or less the same business model. They're based on, I'm not talking about the casinos, I'm talking about construction on the one hand, and low corporate tax rates which attract multinational corporations. Nevada and Ireland. Let's compare and contrast. So you have the 2008 crisis, right? The banking system of Nevada and the banking system of Ireland are hit very badly, and so are the construction services. Now, unemployment goes up in both places, and the banks go bankrupt. The fundamental difference, however, is in the United States. The unemployment benefits are paid by the federal government automatically, not as a result of some kind of negotiation, loans, and so on. And the banks were saved by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the Fed. So imagine if the governor of Nevada had to go to the international markets, cap in hand, without the Fed having his back, to borrow money internationally, or borrow from the IMF, or from Washington, D.C., right, on commercial rates, in order to bail out the banks of Nevada and pay for the unemployment benefits. And imagine if those loans were to be given to the governor of Nevada on condition of cutting pensions, cutting, which effectively would have driven half of the people of Nevada out of Nevada, and Nevada would have been, that's it, kaput forever. So you want to make a comparison between a state of the United States and a member state of the Eurozone? Go ahead, make my day, because it is the comparison that effectively highlights everything I said. Now, will Northern Ireland, will Scotland leave the United Kingdom? Allow me not to comment on that. But what I will say is that there is something worse than the fragmentation of the European Union. So there's something worse than Brexit or Italexit. I'm not in favor of Brexit. I'm not in favor of Italexit because the cost of this fragmentation is going to be huge for Europeans and for the Brits and for the world economy. But there's something worse than that, and that is staying in the European Union in a condition of permanent debt bondage, which is where we are here in Greece. You know, I was talking to, as you know, as Norman said before, I'm leading a small parliamentary party. There are 9 MPs of us, not bad. And as such, as a parliamentary leader, I get to speak to government ministers, some of whom, even though they are on the other side of politics, we have a decent personal relationship. Now, you know, take 5G, right? We are in the process of auctioning off the 5G frequency spectrum in Greece, like most of other countries are. Do you know how much money is going to stay in Greece? 0. Not 1 penny. All of Greek public assets, every single public asset that we have, you know, waterworks, what is left of the electricity grid which has not been privatized, roads, the Parthenon, right? It all belongs to the Troika. They created a fund whose majority within the board of directors is appointed by the Troika. And the constitution of this fund says that every expenditure or privatization or whatever has to be approved by the Troika. Effectively, we have lost not sovereignty, we've lost our right to exist as a state within the European Union. Now, do you really think that this is congenial and this is creating circumstances that make this social economy sustainable and reproducible? I don't think so.
So that brings me neatly on to the very first question we got, which was from Niels Thiessen, regarding the European Monetary Union. Do you think a fiscal union is likely, or is it going to be dissolution, or are you envisaging something else entirely as a consequence of all this?
I've always thought, and this is where Norman and I agree, because we've discussed this many times before. Once you create a common currency, you need to create a common democracy. You need to have a common treasury, and you can't have a common treasury if you don't have a parliament that actually operates like a parliament, not like the European Parliament, which is the only parliament in the world that cannot initiate legislation. And then you have to move towards federation. Either that, or it was a mistake to create a common currency, and this common currency is not going to be conducive to either democratic politics or to shared prosperity. So we have to decide: go federal or start planning for the return to monetary sovereignty. I do not see the European Union having the nous to make a choice. So they are being caught in the middle of the road when there is no middle of the road. And that, I think, is the reason why we have stagnation and why we'll continue to have stagnation.
So you talked about this nous. We have a question from Michael Kenny. If the recovery fund is so small, puny, I think was the word you used.
Yes.
Why does it make any difference to the future of the EU? And, how else could the EU move forward having lost a contributor in that sense? So, yeah, I'd be really interested, because on the one hand, you're saying it's kind of inevitable because of the way that the debt is structured. but yet the recovery fund is puny. So how can it have such a big impact?
It can't and it won't. Look, it's puny, but look, 310 billion euros is macroeconomically insignificant, but very lucrative for some people. Already, the Italian government has collapsed because they're fighting over, how they're going to distribute the dough, right? I can tell you, the oligarchy here in Greece, they are looking at the 10 or 15 billion that is going to come their way, and they're already fighting as to who's going to get it. It's a huge amount of money in terms of the power it can buy. And it is macroeconomically puny and insignificant. It is an awful combination.
Yeah. So you think it's the political value rather than the economic value which will be disruptive?
Look, if we're going to use this 310 billion to build a green energy union, to create an electricity network from renewables that will allow us to create green new jobs and so on across Europe, that would be great. But it does not answer the question, what do you do with the Italian debt, which is going through the roof, while Italian GDP is falling precipitously, in a Europe where investment is rising relatively to Italy and Germany, making those imbalances that were always the root cause of macroeconomic imbalances worse and worse. We're not answering these questions.
So there's a question here from Rajiv Shah from London. He's asking, there was a proposal that Greece would like to have some sort of favourable investment tax property treaty with the UK. Could you throw some light on this? Is this something you know about?
Actually, I don't. But it would be great if we did. I asked a question in Parliament a couple of weeks ago. I asked the Prime Minister whether he's worried, personally worried, that Brexit is causing or forcing the Greek government to adopt punitive measures towards Britain via policies that are dictated to us by Brussels, that will affect British investment in Greece, which was always larger than the investment from other countries, and especially British tourism. So, I even asked the question, are we seriously thinking of making the Brits arriving at our airports stand in the other passports queue? Because, if we do that, while at the same time the euro is going up through the roof because of the austerity policies here, right? Why will they not choose to go to Turkey or to Morocco? And the Prime Minister looked at me and he said, this is a problem, but I don't have an answer. And he sat down. So the Greek-UK relationship is being undermined by the Brexit punitive attitudes within Brussels. And I very much fear that this vaccination scandal now is going to make this worse.
Well, I'd love, you want to elaborate on that last point about the vaccination scandal?
Yes, I've been reading the British press, and I think that even the Brexiteer press is too kind of the EU regarding the vaccination fiasco. Let's be clear. The EU completely messed it up. The initial reaction to COVID-19 was misanthropic and anti-European. You will recall when Germany banned exports of protective equipment from Germany to Italy, when Italy was the epicenter of COVID-19. So in the first phase, there was no solidarity amongst Europeans whatsoever. Then Merkel, who's, she's a sensible woman, right? Said, okay, this is not the way to proceed. Let's operate like a union ought to. So they decided, okay, regarding vaccinations, we're going to order vaccinations centrally, and we're going to distribute them centrally. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm all in favor of that. If we're a union, we should be using our oligopsonistic or monopsonistic power to buy vaccines altogether. And it is right to have a policy of distributing vaccines in proportion to the population of each country within the European Union. And what do they do then? Then the corruption comes in. Complete corruption. The Franco-German axis decided they will place an order of 300 million doses from a German company and 300 million doses from a French company. Why? Because this is how they do things. They distribute the pie between France and Germany. This is how they do it, right? And they decided that the Oxford AstraZeneca thing, but well, we better, put it on the one side because this is Brexit and, this is the UK and we really don't want to deal with them. It's much more important to split the pie, to divide the pie between France and Germany, right? Now, unfortunately, the French vaccine never happened. It flopped. So we ended up with a huge deficit of vaccine. And then they started very late in the piece, demanding the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And we now know that Jens Spahn, the German federal health minister, bypassed the common policy, the common mechanism for purchasing vaccines, and he sought an outside option, which is illegal within the European Union now, because we all agreed that we would do this centrally. And he placed an independent German-only order on the side. So we have a combination of incompetence and corruption.
Mm. Wow, devastating analysis there. Do you think COVID, this is from Jeffrey Dobson, ignoring the human and economic cost of the COVID-19, do you believe that the pandemic will hasten integration of the EU countries, being driven by the need to find an overarching solution to the financial burden that's being created across the whole continent?
The dominant narrative is that it is already doing this. The dominant narrative behind the recovery fund is that, look, we have overcome our aversion, or the Germans' aversion and the Dutch aversion to common debt. We have common debt. We are moving towards integration, and this is only because of COVID-19. And we've moved beyond austerity, and we have set aside a fiscal compact. So there is a strong argument there. But what I try to do in my talk is to deconstruct that argument and to show that at the level of the propaganda, yes, it is working in that direction, but at the level of both finance and macroeconomics, it is not. And if you look at the way in which even QE is working, because let's face it, the only reason why the European Union is still together is the European Central Bank. Everything else is cosmetic. It is the European Central Bank that is printing money as if there is no tomorrow. But look at what is happening with this money. This money is effectively driving up asset prices in places like Germany. And it is not doing anything to create jobs and to be invested into income-generating activities that can rebalance the European economy. So at the level of the narrative, this is exactly what's happening. COVID-19 is bringing together Europeans along the lines of an integrationist narrative. But on the ground, when it comes to the economy and finance, it is pulling us apart.
Do you think, Paul Briggs is asking, given the vested interests of the technocrats, how can national politicians hope to secure meaningful reform to ensure the bloc's survival? So maybe a move to a more federalist model.
Look, I don't agree with this separation of technocrats from politicians. The European Union political scene is such that once you are elected, there is a very powerful drive for you as a politician, as a minister, to comply with the technocratic ethos, with a technocratic way of doing things. If you don't, then you're vilified. And I know this from experience. I see decent human beings being elected to positions of supposed power, government office. They go to Brussels, they sit around those tables in the neon lit rooms in Brussels and elsewhere. They are fed disinformation. Many of the decisions have already been made before they enter the room. And it takes a lot of courage to go against the juggernaut of a bureaucratic machine that effectively tells you, in no uncertain terms, comply or be thrown out.
So how would your federalist model evolve? How would it come about, your democracy, your European democracy?
Well, this is where my radicality comes out. I don't believe that we can do it through persuasion. I don't think I keep saying that the EU cannot be reformed. It cannot be reformed within its institutions. It can only be transformed through conflict. This is why I believed so powerfully that in 2015 it was important to have a rupture, to say a no and have a major crisis. Because, if they threw us out of the euro in 2015, that would have really made it impossible to continue to do business as usual, because, it wouldn't stop there. Mm-hmm. And if they didn't throw us out and they gave us a debt restructure and they did some of the things that we were demanding, then that would be a profound radical change. Allow me a very quick thought experiment. Now, I know that Norman is probably going to have a stroke hearing me say this, but imagine just for a moment, let's do hypothetical.
Lord Lamont, when you need to.
Imagine for a moment that, Gordon Brown had not stopped Tony Blair from dragging the United Kingdom into the euro back in the mid-2000s. And imagine that you were in the euro in 2008, right? With the city of London being oversized the way it is. Imagine it was all denominated in euros. There would be no way without a sovereign central bank that you would be able to save the city and to effectively to keep the Eurozone going if Britain was in the Eurozone. It would be impossible to bail out Britain and the city from Frankfurt given the fractures. Now, in a sense, I wish you were in, only because if you were in 2008, the European Union would never be able to continue as it does now. Brexit would be very hard for the reasons why Grexit was very hard, but it would be impossible for Angela Merkel to continue to use austerity and the ECB the way she did in order effectively to extend and pretend the crisis. Something would have to give. Either we would all go back to our sovereign national currencies, or the European Union would be transformed in a way that reform cannot procure.
There's another question here which kind of relates as well to this issue about transformation versus reform. Stephen Balloch, is there any plausible scenario in which medium-sized countries such as the Netherlands or Austria are given a genuine mandate to play honest broker amongst the big beasts of the EU 27 in helping to develop the future shape of the EU? Surely their voices must be heard eventually.
Yes, except that, their voices have been quite destructive. In my experience, when I was in the Eurozone, the Dutch and the Austrian finance ministers were out competing with one another on who would be more royalist than the king, who would out Schäuble. They did their countries and their own people and electorates an immense disservice by, not asserting the sovereign voice that they could have asserted, given that they are surplus countries. So I don't see this happening, I'm afraid.
Interesting. There's so many questions. What do you think about gold overtaking USD in Russia's dollar in Russia's international reserves? Is this a trend that will continue around the world with lower dollar reserve assets held? It's a sort of tangential question.
No. Putin is trying to extricate himself from the payment system, which is based on dollars, simply because he's scared about himself and the oligarchs in case some, administration in Washington, whether it's Biden or somebody else, clamp down on the Russian oligarchy. If you are, a Chinese industrialist, if you are a high value added operation, then you have to use the dollar, because let's face it, it's the international payment system. And in the end, you've got to store your wad of dollars somewhere. Where do you put it? You have to buy US Treasury bills. So the answer is no.
Okay. There's another question here. I'm trying to sort of pick out the ones that we haven't really covered before. This is actually from somebody who hasn't given their name. Has Yanis considered how the private sector is helping with stabilization? This is an interesting question.
Of course. I mean, without the private sector, there's no economy. There's no public sector, and vice versa. Without the public sector, there's no private sector. My concern is that we have a gross imbalance, both in the private sectors and in the public sectors of the European Union. So let me give an example from Greece, because Greece is such an extreme case that it's quite didactic, quite educational. When we had the world's harshest fiscal consolidation in the history of capitalism, between 2009 and 2011, we had austerity up to 18% of GDP, right? So cuts of 18% of GDP in a country where the state is 40% of GDP. So you can imagine, right? You can imagine. What happened there? Well, the narrative of the Troika was that, reverse crowding out, the state comes out and the private sector steps in to fill the void. No, because when you are already having a diminution of GDP, expenditure in the private sector is coming down because of the post-2008 crisis globally, and you have the state reducing public expenditure, including public investment, so harshly. What really happens is the rate of acceleration of the recession increases and the private sector collapses. So the capacity of that's not always the case when it comes to austerity. So when Sweden in 1992, when Canada in the mid-1990s went through a process of austerity, of reduction of public spending, that worked because the private sector stepped in. But the private sector stepped in only because that was a period, the 1990s, of global growth. The United States was growing immensely next to Canada. So as the Canadian federal government was cutting down its spending, then the private sector could pick up, aided and abetted by the growth engine that was next door, the United States, similarly with Sweden. But when you have universal austerity during a period of recession, the private sector cannot play a stabilizing role.
So I've got to ask you this, I guess. This is chairman's privilege now. I'm going to ask a question. Good. Why did you support for the UK to remain in the vote, the Brexit vote? What's given that you want a shock to the system, so we move to a federal democracy across Europe, which I'm kind of putting words in your own mouth now, but why did you support Remain?
Well, for a number of reasons, some of them good, some of them, as it proved, not so good. I'll start with the not so good to be self-critical first. I took it for granted, and in the end, I was wrong, that take Nissan. Nissan was claiming, with some rationale, with good cause, that given the supply chains crisscrossing Europe, that if delays between in the transportation system were introduced, then it would have to divest from Newcastle and shift production to places like Romania, France, Barcelona, and so on. That made sense to me. In the end, we had the opposite. So I was wrong there. I overestimated the effect of Brexit on investment by companies like Nissan in the UK. But then there were good reasons too. My main reason, which I still hold on to, is the idea that the EU is not sustainable as it is, but it will always remain a very important trading partner of the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom is mistaken to think that Brexit is not going to have secondary ill effects on Britain. Not because of the primary ill effects, not because of what you're going to lose simply by not being in the EU, but because your absence, your removal, your departure from the EU is going to make the EU even more of a stagnation force, more of a deflation exporter. And this is going to have secondary ill effects on the United Kingdom that will not be ameliorated by whatever trade deals you have with Australia, New Zealand, India, and China. And one more reason, I don't like borders. I like the idea, you know, I'm actually speaking to you now from an island, which is off the coast of Attica. I'm on a hill, it's a lovely place. My next door neighbors are Brits. They're actually Brits from Newcastle, who are now, you know, locked down here instead of being in Newcastle. It's a very, very smart decision there. But you know, they're going to have serious problems now, coming and going. I do really believe that Britain became a better place as a result of freedom of movement, and the European Union and Greece became a better place because the Brits used to come and go freely. It may sound as a lesser issue, but for me, the cultural integration of Britain in the European Union is of great importance to both the European Union and Britain. You decide whether this kind of connection with Europe is good for you, but I will simply say that it is definitely good for us. Look, I have a problem with Central Europe in the sense that Central European capitalism has always been corporatist and always prone towards authoritarianism and even fascism. And, you know, a splash of British liberalism, of the British liberalism that I see both on the right and of the left of British politics. If you look at the Tories and the Labour Party, there are more liberal people than the left and the right in continental Europe. Mm. Right? And I'm missing that now that Brexit has happened.
Yanis, thank you so much. I've learned an enormous amount, and I've, as an ardent, what you would have called an ardent Remainer, it's made me think a little bit about what future of Europe I would actually really want and how we get there. So that's been really helpful. Lord Lamont, I'm going to hand over to you to say a couple of final words, I think, before we close in a couple of minutes.
Yes, well, thank you, Jackie, for sharing that session. And my apologies again for having usurped the chat session, completely misunderstood the whole format of the evening. But I think we got as many questions in as we were planning to do. Yanis, thank you very much. Marvelous, very compelling exposition. I thought the analysis of the Eurozone particularly devastating. That, of course, was for some people one of the reasons for arguing for Brexit, that we did not want to be so close to the Eurozone, that the EU was becoming more and more dominated by Eurozone affairs. Minds were concentrated on that, that really we were no longer quite at the heart of so many things and did not have the same priorities as the rest of the EU. Whenever I hear Yanis speak, I have to ask myself, now, where do I disagree with this? And I agreed with almost everything you said tonight. I even agree that we have to fear a little the change in attitudes that will take place within the EU without Britain being there. I think that could be adverse for Britain, and I think there are some ugly signs emerging already. But other than that, I personally wouldn't accept your views of where you ultimately want the EU to go, but I think you've, as always, been extremely eloquent, extremely energetic, and extremely patient in answering all our questions. So thank you very, very much, as always.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're going to find the Zoom call closes any moment now. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. I'm sorry I didn't get through to all of your questions, but a very, very interesting discussion. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.